So we have the next assignment due on gymnosperms is April 25th. And that's for points. And then the extra credit is due the Saturday before final exam week. Okay, so those are posted now in EDUCAT and they're open and available. Well, the angiosperm will become available this afternoon. Okay, so don't forget to do those, please. All right, we've been talking about angiosperm evolution, looking at flower design and how that has evolved over time. And I think we left off looking at the beautiful orchids and all the wonderful different strains that they've created over the time now. It's amazing. So when you watch that video, so next Tuesday, you'll be, well, I think we're going to be doing a at-home video assignment for next Tuesday's lab, kind of give you a break. And as we head into the last week, and it's another Sir David Attenborough video, and he'll talk about the idea of how plants have co-evolved with their pollinators in order to attract their pollinators for pollination, of course. And then the other idea is once the fruit is made, you need to get that dispersed. But his video focuses more on all the strategies that plants have evolved. Orchids are famous for being rather sneaky toward their pollinators. They often don't provide much payoff for the pollinator. They kind of trick them. Not all, but many do. And so he'll talk a little bit about some of the tricks, so to speak, that plants have evolved, the orchids especially. One other thing that I wanted to mention briefly is going back to this phylogenetic tree. We have those so-called basal angiosperms. So those are the most ancient groups of angiosperms. If it's closer to the bottom of the phylogenetic tree in this case, that means that they're more ancient. So if they come off this line quite quickly, they're more ancient than if you follow the line all the way out to the eudicots, for example. So I just wanted to mention a few things. So we have the three groups here. I'm going to refer, if I ask you a question about them, they'll be called basal angiosperms. I won't be zooming in on the phylum names or the group names. I'll just say basal angiosperms. So some examples would be the water lily, which is still present today, especially around here. If you ever canoe or kayak inland lakes, there's a lot of water lilies in this area. And again, if you look at their flowers, they are representing an ancient flower type where you have lots and lots of flower parts. None of the flower parts are really fused together. They're all just lots of parts freely there. And then when you peer in more toward the center, you'll see lots and lots of stamens as well, the male part of the flower. So that's a good example, and we certainly have those around here in the summer. Here's another one. Ambarella is another basal angiosperm, and they think it's still alive today, and they think that it's the most closely related plant to the earliest angiosperms. So it's still alive and kicking. It hasn't quite yet developed vessels. So at this point in the evolutionary trajectory, this plant is without vessels, which is pretty odd. You know, we usually say angiosperms have vessels. And this is one example where they do not. And so that's another reason why they're closer to the root of the phylogenetic tree when you look at that. And then magnolids, that group also, fig fits into that. That's what you're seeing on the left, is part of the magnolid group. And then the picture on the right is where we get black pepper from, peppercorns and black pepper. So again, another example of more ancient groups of angiosperms. So when we're thinking about the seed plants encompass gymnosperms and angiosperms. And this, again, looking at the seed plants, they think they evolved around 365 million years ago. So that would be the gymnosperms. The gymnosperms came before the angiosperms with regard to the different seed plants. And then you see the angiosperms evolved around 142 million years ago. So that's around the early Cretaceous period. So when you look at some of the, in some of your other classes, maybe BI 111 or 112, they may have showed you like the progression of the evolutionary process of the different organisms. Maybe in BI 112, they might cover it. And so I've highlighted on this table looking at, zooming in on plants and how they fit into the timescale of the evolutionary process. So you can see when you get into the Cenozoic area, you got those insects starting to show up and that they're playing a part in pollination. Angiosperms are becoming the dominant plants in that time period. But if you go all the way down to the bottom, that's the earliest in the way that this person in the organization, the Precambrian period, you're starting to see, okay, algae are showing up. And then you start to see the shift onto terrestrial land when you get into the Paleozoic. And then as you continue on, you start to finally see vascular plants that have xylem and phloem. And then you get into the gymnosperms further up, close to the Triassic period. And then the Jurassic period, most people are most familiar with that, with the Hollywood movies on the Jurassic period and the dinosaurs. And then you finally see the angiosperms appearing. Okay. So it's just kind of laying out the process, thinking about all the different phyla we've been covering this semester. We didn't really in lecture get to cover much algae, but then shifting on to terrestrial land with the bryophytes, then we get into the seedless vascular plants, and then the gymnosperms that have seeds, although they're naked seeds. Now we're focusing in on the angiosperms that have fruit production to help out with their seed dispersal. So most of the crops that we grow and eat are in the angiosperm group. And I just wanted to say a little bit about that. When you look at crop diversity, there's been a lot of debate over the years of where crops, like when people started farming, where did these crops actually start to be farmed? Where do we see this happening? So there's been a lot of shifting ideas about this, and and with more and more things in the fossil record and the excavations that they do at different sites, they're starting to piece together. When you look at wheat, which of course is a hugely successful plant, we across the globe grow wheat now. From a plant perspective, it has really taken over. It's able to grow in so many regions of the world because of its interaction with us. And they think that it was actually in the areas of Syria, Jordan, Turkey, and Russia that those plants were adapted to and started to be worked with by humans over 10,000 years ago, we're thinking now, when humans started to learn how to grow crops and domesticate crops instead of being more, traveling around and foraging for their food. And so wheat is incredibly successful. And then not too long ago, they learned how to create better versions of wheat that then just exploded the wheat growth in terms of the farming of wheat. It's been a very, very successful crop. Rice is also hugely successful, grown in mostly in Asia still. And they think that there's at least 3 different times that it was domesticated. When they look back around 10,000 years ago, they see that different groups of people were domesticating in different regions in Asia primarily. So that's another huge crop. Corn is a huge crop, especially here in America. We grow lots of corn, and it's actually derived from teosinte, which is being shown here on the left. That's the wild version of corn. So that is what they started with. And then over selective breeding and thousands of years, we now have the corn that we grow today. And again, really successful plant from the plant perspective. It has been able to spread in its habitat and grow and grow and grow because of its interaction with humans. So today, you know, a lot of corn is a good example of the idea of selective breeding, where they're going for, you know, if you look at this teosinte, there's not a whole lot of fruit production there. And as you know, I'm sure you're familiar with corn on the cob from, you know, it's usually at the height of summer, they start to have it abundantly in the grocery stores. And you can see, you know, when you look at teosinte, our corn on the cob is much bigger, much more kernels per cob. And they've also bred it to be much sweeter than the wild version. And so that has led to some issues when you do selective breeding for certain traits. Unfortunately, you know, this is occurring over thousands of years, but even in the recent history of corn breeding and production, you know, they're really pushing for sweetness because that's what we like, and that will make that corn very profitable, which is understandable. You want to make a profit when you sell your corn. But on the other hand, when they breed for sweetness, sometimes they weren't really paying attention to some of the other traits of corn that maybe should have been kept, like its ability to defend itself against diseases, against pathogens. And so we're starting to realize, kind of looking hindsight now, looking back at how we've manipulated and selectively bred some of our crops. It's actually to our detriment, because now we're kind of in a pickle where a lot of the crops that we're growing, they've kind of lost their ability in some extent, not totally, but they've lost some of their ability to defend themselves against pathogens. We're finding a bigger issue with that. So breeding for sweetness, sometimes they forget about some of the other traits that you don't want to lose in the process. So it's a real balance that you have to maintain when you're breeding plants for crop production. I like this slide because it's kind of an eye-opener. So wild mustard. Wild mustard is where we get all these other crops that are commonly grown. It's originating from the wild mustard plant. And so they took the wild mustard and selectively bred it till you get kohlrabi. And then you can see Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, cabbage, broccoli, kale. Okay, it's all coming from the wild mustard plant. And through selective breeding and, you know, thousands of years of effort, we get this diversification from this one wild relative. So I thought that's a pretty interesting story, looking at how you can take that one plant and through different ways of selective breeding end up with very different looking plants and different parts of the plant that we end up eating. So when you go back, by the way, with broccoli, when you eat broccoli, that's actually the flower that you're eating. A lot of people don't realize that. Cauliflower, at least the word flower is right in the name there, but yeah, so interesting to get all of that from one wild relative. Grasses are kind of a world unto themselves. I'm not going to get into their flower anatomy, so you don't need to know this in terms of the flower anatomy. I just wanted to point out that they have more nondescript flowers. There's some unique design to the grass family when you look at their flowers and the arrangement. And so very, very successful group of plants though, because we have, I mean, if you just look at the grasses in your lawn, and then what we grow in terms of wheat and barley and oats and on and on and on. Very, very successful interaction with humans over and then tiny, this is a pin, the tip of a pin that's stabbed into this duckweed plant. And you can see the stigma of the flower is the farthest left thing that you see sticking up there. Tiny. The world's smallest flower, at least that we know of, is the duckweed flower. And so you can see it's absolutely tiny. Sometimes it's referred to, some people call it water meal, because it kind of looks like grains floating around in the water, like someone's built some grains, and it's actually a small duckweed aquatic plant. Okay, so flower design is hugely diverse in the angiosperms. The last several slides are not anything I'm going to test you over. Some people have asked over the years a little bit more information about orchids. You know, they wanted to know a little bit more. So this is just in case you're interested. But it's not anything I'll ask you about. So it wasn't until 1904, 200 years after orchids were brought to Europe, they finally figured out that a fungus is needed to germinate the seeds. So in the 1800s, orchid hunters were, that was a thing. If you were a wealthy Victorian era person, you would hire orchid hunters if you were in the plant. And they would go hunt plants. They go all over the world and hunt plants and rip them up out of their native habitat, bring them back to your private conservatory where you could boast. It's kind of like having, you know, heads on the wall when you go hunting. It's kind of that idea where they could have these in their private collection and show them off to all their wealthy friends. So it was quite the thing. And it got to the point where like people would murder each other over these orchids. There's cases of that happening and being documented, that one orchid hunter would kill another one for that orchid. And so it was a thing, kind of a wild and rough era for the orchid plant. And then when they finally figured out, oh, we can grow the seeds if we just get the right fungus, that kind of helped turn the tide so that the orchids weren't getting ripped out of their native habitat and people weren't going crazy and trying to kill each other over some of these. So, and then tissue culture started, you know, how do we clone these plants? That became a thing, and that again helped out so that orchids can stay in their native habitats and not be threatened with extinction. So unfortunately, there was a person not too long ago, maybe, I don't know, 5-10 years ago here in the UP, he got caught stealing orchids up here in the UP. The police, someone I think might have reported seeing him putting the orchids in his trunk of his car, and they called the police. They pulled him over. He got caught right with, he was from Germany originally, and he was over here visiting. Thought he'd help himself to some orchids. So it still happens, but it's not quite as common because we know how to clone them using tissue culture techniques, and we know how to germinate the seeds if you have the right fungus. Bribery, espionage, intrigue, and murder. Yeah. Sander the Orchid King, if you want to read some light summer reading on the wacky wild world of orchid hunting. Colombia, that region, that country has the largest number of orchid species. And of course, they're used for decoration. The only edible thing that we get from orchids, so far anyways, is vanilla. That's taken from a vining orchid in the tropics. Some perfume gets extracted, medicinal. The only thing I could find on that so far was the eucalyptus extracts from Cattleya. And then there's some medicinal astringents too that they extract. And if you're going for the showiest flowers, pick a Cattleya. Look up for that and see if you want to purchase one of those. I don't know what the price range is on some of these orchids. I tend to go for the ones that you find just locally. And I'm sure some of them can get quite pricey, but the Phalaenopsis that you see in stores around here, they're pretty average price. They're not too bad. Okay, so, all right, so we've been talking about flowers, looking at flower design, evolution of the flower, and then what I'd like to get into next is looking at the flowers and fruits. So that's the flowers and fruits first, part one. Okay, so you're seeing two different flowers here. And calling out the petals is probably the best way to answer this question. So which one is the monocot? The one on the left or the one on the right? You're answering for both, but the right. So petals in threes is characteristic of monocot. It's a little challenging. Maybe you get better eyesight than me. You might see that the veins in the petals on the right are more parallel. A little hard to see. The left flowers, you can see the veins a little bit better in the petals, and you can see they're more netted. Sometimes the leaf or the petal variation can be difficult to see. So I usually rely on counting the petals and looking at that. That's usually the easiest. And so dicots are clusters of 4 and 5 petals, netted venation. Monocots, you tend to see 3 petals, and monocots have parallel venation. How about this one? 2 different flower designs. Which one is more ancient? The one on the left or the one on the right? Yeah, the left. Why is the left one the correct answer? That's more ancient. What's one reason why you would say it's ancient?
Not fused.
Not fused. Lots of petals, right? They really, really went at it with lots of petals, lots of all in the middle there, what you're looking at. Whoops, let me get my laser. Lots and lots of stamens, just a ton of them surrounding the central, female part of the flower. So then on the right, you see more fusion going on, fancier design, fewer petals though, and they're fused. The male and female parts are fused in the center. Okay, this one is tricky. Okay, so this one, I could see either way you answer it, I get why you would answer it, but it's tricky. All right, so first of all, when you look at all of what's going on up here, you don't see, it's kind of hard. It looks like maybe 3 petals, but it's a little hard to see. But then you see that there's a lot of the male parts, stamen, lots of them. So you might be tempted to say it's ancient because it's lots of stamen. But in this case, what trumps that is where the ovary is located. So ovary position trumps how many parts to the rest of the flower. Does that make sense? So where is the ovary? Is it superior or half or inferior? They kind of dissect it in a way a little bit so you can see it a bit better. Where is the ovary? Is it below or above the rest of the flower parts? Yeah, it's below. It's inferior. So the ovary is the swollen part down here. Okay, and they dissected it so you can peer in there. So ovary position trumps the rest of the flower in the number of parts you see there. So even though you look at the top and you say, oh, it's ancient because there's lots of flower parts, but hold off before you make that judgment. See if you can see where the ovary is, and that trumps. So we know that inferior ovaries are a more advanced trait. Okay. All right, so gymnosperms and angiosperms produce pollen. And so pollination is a thing that we need to think about in both of those groups. When we focused on the gymnosperms, we said, really, it's wind. It's the typical way is to have wind. Only a few groups have they really seen active involvement of like beetles, for example, or maybe a small mammal, but that's not the norm. It seems like wind. Well, with angiosperms, we have more going on than wind, but we do have that happening, especially when you look at some of the tree species around here that have catkins, that are, the flowers are very nondescript. They're usually greenish brown, so they blend into the rest of the tree. And so if you see male flowers that are very nondescript, they're not flashy, it usually means it's going to be a wind pollination process, because there's no visual cues trying to attract a pollinator. There are a handful of species that are water rely on water. If you think about some of the aquatic plants, I guess that makes sense, right? That you would have water current and water movement that, and if you are around here in the spring and you look at some of our inland lakes around here, sometimes you can see them well coated on the surface with pollen. And the pollen starts drifting around. And so like with the water lilies, you can see pollination occurring through that process. Some species actually have designs on their pollen or on the male part of the flower. So like the male part, like the anther will break free and there'll be like appendages on it to look almost like a sail on a sailboat. And it will, of course, catch the wind and then get skittered across the surface of the lake and hopefully find the female flower. So there's some really interesting designs on some of these aquatic plants. Gravity, yeah, that plays a role to some extent as well. But probably wind is a big one out of these three. Wind is probably more common. Then we get into active pollination, where you have this idea of another organism involved in getting the pollen transferred. And when you think about the angiosperms, it's going to be from the anther, which is where the pollen is located in the male part, the anther, to the stigma. And so that's the pollination process with the angiosperms. And so we're talking about this idea of coevolution between the plant and its pollinator. And in the notes section, I have the definition of what that means, coevolution. And it's the process where you have two or more species as selective forces on one. Read the notes section, the definition of coevolution. So I'd like you to know that definition, please, and be able to recognize that. Okay, so process in which two or more species act as selective forces on one another, and then they each undergo evolutionary change as they do this back and forth interaction with each other over time. And so it's really fascinating to see the mechanisms at play here with the different plant species and what they've done through the coevolutionary process to stay tight with their pollinator so that they have an efficient mechanism to get pollination to occur. So you need to appreciate that not all organisms see the way we do, and pollinators are no exception. There's many pollinators like bees, they don't see how we see. And I'll show you some examples of that. And then, other organisms that do pollination, you can say the same. And so we're going to find that there's going to be pollinators that have different colors that they're attracted to, or maybe they just can't see the color like we do. And so there'll be this difference. And the plants have, nurtured that pollinator. And, plants are known to even change their flower color to suit a different pollinator. There's some wild species like a tobacco plant that they studied in the wild that was able to morph the color of its flower and actually start attracting a nocturnal pollinator. Usually it opens its flowers during the day. Well, there was a situation in this part of the country where pests were really causing problems for this group of tobacco plants in the area. And so the strategy they evolved because of that pressure of getting attacked by these pests was to try to open their flowers at night and get pollination to occur that way. And it was their way to try to get around this infestation that they were dealing with. And so it was really a quick change too. I mean, it didn't take hundreds of years. It was within a season they could see this shift. So plants are able to do that. And it's quite fascinating how adaptable they can be in order to switch pollinators if they have to under certain selection pressures. Often it's a reward. The plant will advertise, it will attract a particular pollinator, and then it rewards that pollinator for visiting the flower. And so it's a win-win, because if you get the pollinator there, hopefully it's going to pick up some pollen, maybe drop off some pollen on the stigma, and then move on and transfer the pollen to another plant nearby. And then the pollinator usually either eats some of the pollen or it gets rewarded by nectar that the plant will produce. And sometimes with orchids, it's just oils that the pollinator is after. Some bees and wasps, for example, will coat their body in the oil the orchid is making as kind of an attractant to attract mates. So there's some different strategies. About 84% of the crops of the food we eat rely on pollinators. And so if you talk to people who are in the area of bees and what's going on with colony collapse disorder and all the other issues that are affecting bee populations, it's rather scary because we rely so heavily on bees for their ability to pollinate our crops. And so I'll mention a little bit more about that. And so the bees are incredibly important if we want a good food source, a consistent food source to feed billions of people and growing in population. Okay, so those catkins I was mentioning. So here are the male catkins on the top right, hanging down. What you're seeing on the kind of look like pine cones. Those are actually flowers from last year that are dying off. Here again, some catkins just kind of dangling off the tree. And so when you look at the catkins, they're inflorescences, which means there's a bunch of tiny flowers all clustered together into that catkin arrangement. And very simple. They cut out the petals because they're not trying to be showy. They don't want to invest energy in making petals if that's not how they're getting pollinated. They don't rely on pollinators. So it doesn't make sense to get all flashy about it and advertise. So yes, they're wind pollinated. This is an excellent example of a wind pollination strategy where, don't be fancy, make a lot of pollen. They're pendulant, hanging down like that. So when the wind hits them, they kind of dangle and shake, and that releases a lot of the pollen out of there. So it's a really good strategy, and they make a lot of pollen. They have to, because wind pollination is not terribly efficient, and so they have to produce a lot of pollen. So those of you who have allergies to certain tree species pollen, I empathize. It's challenging because there's so much pollen that gets made. It's very, very abundant in the spring. So here you're looking at elder catkins. So the female flower is on the left. This is from the older year, and then the catkins. All right, so wind pollination, yes, it's a strategy. If that's your strategy, make lots of pollen so that you can have some success. But usually, when we think about the angiosperms, it's something with a pollinator, an actual other organism that's helping this process. So here you're looking at the honeybee idea, and really, really important in our crop production. So here you're looking at different flower designs. I wanted to bring up this idea. So when they look at the evolution of the flower, and we talked about flowers can be perfect or imperfect. If they're perfect, that means they have both male and female parts in one flower. They think that is a more recent development in flower design, because older flowers in the evolutionary and fossil record, you kind of see that there's a fair number of imperfect flowers. And then as evolution proceeded, you see more and more perfect flowers starting to appear. And they think that is an efficient way because when, like, for example, when this bee goes to a perfect flower, it's both picking up pollen and dropping off to the same flower, right? So if it's perfect, it can get some of the pollen. As it's going around on the flower, it can drop off some pollen from a previous visit onto the stigma and then fly off and do that all over again. So they think perfect flowers are pretty great, good, advanced design. And so when you look at imperfect flowers, then we start thinking about, in the angiosperm world, we say, okay, is it a monoecious or dioecious situation? And that is only to do with imperfect flowers, not perfect. All right, so if you have an imperfect flower, that means if it's a monoecious condition, that means one plant has both male and female on that one plant, male and female flowers. So it's one house. But if you have a dioecious condition, then you have one plant that's just having the male flowers on it, and then you have a separate plant that has just the female flowers. Dioecious, two houses. So this only can pertain to imperfect flowers. Where are the male and female flowers showing up? Okay, so please, I will be asking about this concept. So please make sure that you're thinking about that idea. Now, if you're monoecious, if you have male and female flowers on the same plant, often you don't want pollen from your same plant. You want pollen to get a better access to diverse genes when they go through sexual reproduction. And so often they will have strategies in place to try to minimize self-pollination, where the pollen from the male flower goes right over to the female same plant. And so often what they can do is they will delay, like for example, the male flower may mature first, you get mature pollen, but the female flower isn't ready to go yet, no eggs yet. And so even if the pollen did land, the female won't be receptive. So they sometimes stagger the maturation of the flower. Sometimes too, what they find is that the stigma produces chemicals that won't let the pollen from its own plant germinate. And they're still trying to figure that out. But they know that there are certain plants that produce a chemical stigma that will kind of inhibit its own pollen from germinating and fertilizing. So, and then if you're monoecious, if you are having those male female could self-pollinate, but often that's not the choice. You want to cross-pollinate. You want pollen from another nearby plant. But technically, yes, you could self-pollinate or cross-pollinate. Dioecious, when you have a female on one plant and a male flower on another, then they don't have a choice. The only thing they can do is cross, right? So that kind of makes sense. They're on two different plants. So sometimes you'll hear cross-pollination as outbreeding. You'll hear that word, and then self-pollination as inbreeding. I tend to say cross-pollination or self-pollination, but just be aware that other people will talk about outbreeding versus inbreeding. And in general, it's considered better for plants to do cross-pollination because you're mixing up, you're getting more diverse genes from pollen from other plants and getting that mixing up going on through sexual reproduction. Okay, so some examples. Here is a monoecious condition where you have one plant that has both the male and the female flower on one plant. So the females on the left, those are stigmas that you're looking at. And then here on the right, that flower is the male. See the pollen on the really big anthers, lots of pollen ready to go, right? So the trick here, if you want to cross-pollinate, you want pollen from another plant coming over and landing on the stigma. But this is a really good example of imperfect flowers. Corn is an excellent example of a monoecious plant with a male flower. So we often, the jargon is you call it the tassel. The tassel is really the male flower, and that's usually on the top of the corn plant. And then the female flowers are down low. It's kind of weird to realize that when you bite into corn on the cob, you're eating fruit. It's weird. But educate your friends, family, because like your mom probably said, eat your vegetables, but 9 times out of 10, when people say eat your vegetables, it's usually really a fruit. So when you think about that, fruit derives from a fertilized egg and then a fusion of the sperm with the polar nuclei. So double fertilization event will get you fruit development. And so by definition, a fruit is coming from a flower, where those eggs were fertilized. And so, yeah, corn is a fruit. Each little kernel that you bite into is a fruit. It's considered a dry fruit. We'll talk about that. But corn on the cob, every single kernel that you bite into is a dry fruit. And if you've ever peeled down the corn on the cob, peeled the husk away, and you see all this silk, if you carefully do that, that's actually the stigma and style. That silk, that's what that is. And if you carefully peel that away, you see it attaches, each silk attaches to one kernel. All right, and so you have to get the pollen landing on the so-called silk, but that silk is really the stigma and style, the female flower. And you can see here the pollen very, pretty much relies on wind pollination to get, and gravity to some extent, to get the pollen to fall if you're going to self-pollinate or cross-pollinate. Here is a case of two houses, dioecious. So that means you have imperfect flowers. You have a male on a separate plant and then the female on a different separate plant. So on the left, in this case, you're seeing the female flowers. And then you can see the stigmas kind of sticking out, the light green. And then over here on the right, the brown, those are the anthers. And then the filament. So box elder tends to be, it's not very flashy at all. It tends to be a wind pollination event. So if you want to promote cross-pollination, outbreeding, you would strategize for a dioecious plant. You have two separate houses where you have male plants and you have female plants on two separate. Box elder bugs. They're a thing. Yeah, and do they eat the pollen or anything? They hang out. Apparently, they must hang out around box elders if that's their name. Huh? Huh? You've seen them too? So they kind of have a flush where they are present. Okay. Oh, okay. So what area of the country are you? Oh, okay. Oh, cool looking. Yeah. I just saw a picture. He showed me the laptop, the picture of it. Yeah, real cool. Yeah, so I don't know much about them, obviously, and I don't really, I grew up in this area and I don't really remember. They're pretty flashy looking. I think I would have remembered. So I don't know. I guess I just am not around many box elders around here. So again, some of these ideas of it, if you're trying to promote pollen coming from a different plant to a flower on a different plant, you want some strategies. Dioecious would be one. You get your male parts maturing before the female or vice versa. And then they say the stigma may not be receptive. That's usually some chemical they think that's being produced that's going to inhibit any of the self-pollen. And then there's this vague term that they say self-incompatibility, which again, they don't quite know what that means. They think it's some chemical makeup again between the stigma and surface that they're not quite sure about. So they're still investigating that. But in general, there tends to be this strategy of trying to get pollen from an outside source. If you're in a perfect flower, trying to get it from a different plant so that you're mixing up the genes. So here is an interesting picture. So if you can, let me blow this up a little bit. I gotta turn off my laser pointer. So here on the left, what you're seeing in that flower on the left, if you see the, like that yellow ball, that's the stigma and it's actually closed. All right, it's in its closed state. And then you can see the anthers kind of below that, the more whitish, longer looking things. Those are the anthers. And you can see that there's pollen that's been shed. All right. But the stigma is closed up and not receptive. Then after the pollen is all the way shed, now look at the flower on the right here where that ball has opened up. And so now the stigma's like, I want pollen from a different source. I don't want this pollen right here. I want pollen from a different source. And so it waited, timed it so that the pollen got shed first, and then the stigma opens. And it's hoping, so to speak, for pollen from a different plant. So pretty simple strategy, just stagger the maturity of the male and female, the timing of it. And that's a common strategy. All right, so if you're trying to promote cross-pollination, and if you're relying on a pollinator, your visual ability, then think like a marketing person. You want, it pays to advertise, you want to advertise effectively to attract that pollinator. So if you were trying to get the attention of a pollinator, you wouldn't be drab and minimal. You'd be flashy, right? Lots of flower parts and you'd be flashy. And so it tends to be where either you have big petals or numerous petals, enough so that it's a visual display against the background of your branches and leaves or your stem tissue. Often too, you'll see when you're hiking around, you see flowers that have a fairly decent stalk length on them. They're typically going to be looking for cross-pollination because they're kind of getting their flower up off the rest of the mother plant so that it's pretty noticeable and out there. Now, scent can be tricky because it really does depend on the pollinator. Some pollinators have a good nose for scent, others do not. And so, but again, we find that plants will produce odor if that pollinator can pick up on that and use that as a cue to get to the flower. But other, like birds, they think birds don't really have a great sense of smell. So those flowers that are pollinated by birds, if you go to sniff it, you really don't smell much of anything. Pollen grains, if you're not wind pollinated, you can be a little bit less flamboyant on how many pollen grains you make because you're much more targeted in pollination strategy. Wind pollination, you get tons of pollen. If it's a pollinator that you're trying to attract, you don't have to make as much. You still make a decent amount, but not as much. Okay, so these are some of the things to think about when you're out hiking in summer and looking around at all the different flower designs. Start looking at some of these ideas, and you can figure out what's going on. So honeybees see things differently. So when we look at this plant, we see the purple. We would see how it looks on the left. They use special filters on the camera to show on the right what a bee would see when it looks at this same exact flower. Very, very different. And you can see how the lines, the red lines on the flower petal really are standing out. And so, and then the red in the center, so it's almost like a target, like the lines are like, go here, go to the center. And so you often see some kind of targeting pattern like that, where you're visually trying to show, go to the red center. That's where the payoff is. And so for the honeybee, it's very easy for them to zoom in and get to the center where the nectar is. And in the process, of course, the honeybee is transferring pollen. Again, on the left, this is what a bee would see. On the right, it's what we see. So again, on the left, you can see that targeting pattern again, where it's really saying, you know, come to the center, into the flower, and that's where the payoff. This is a lovely just yellow. And it's just like the base of the mountain and more of a directing. All right, we'll continue on with that on Thursday and get into a little bit of fruit production eventually too. But we got to stop here.